The drive from Zaragoza to La Rioja took Peter through some of Spain's most beautiful countryside. Rolling hills covered with perfectly ordered rows of grapevines that stretched to the horizon. The autumn light cast everything in golden tones, creating a landscape that looked like a Renaissance painting come to life. But Peter's appreciation for the scenery was tempered by his growing awareness that each mile brought him closer to a confrontation he wasn't sure he was ready for. The documents from the monastery had been specific about the location he was seeking. Bodega de los Secretos, established 1489, 3 kilometers north of Haro on the road to Briones. The vineyard had supposedly been purchased with proceeds from the Zaragoza operation, designed as both a working winery and a secure storage facility for the network's most valuable assets. As Peter approached the town of Haro, he could see why his ancestors had chosen this region for their operations. La Rioja was geographically isolated, surrounded by mountains and accessible only through a few main roads that could be easily monitored. The wine industry provided perfect cover for international commerce, with barrels and shipments moving regularly across European borders without arousing suspicion. The GPS on his rental car led him along increasingly narrow roads that wound through terraced vineyards and past traditional wineries with names like Marqués de Riscal and López de Heredia. But the Bodega de los Secretos wasn't among the famous establishments that welcomed tourists. It was hidden at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by abandoned vines that hadn't been tended in decades. Peter parked his car behind a stone wall where it wouldn't be visible from the main road, then approached the winery on foot. The buildings were substantial stone construction that looked like it could survive centuries, with traditional tile roofs and arched doorways that spoke of significant investment during the vineyard's operational period. But what struck Peter most forcefully was the complete abandonment of the place. Weeds grew between cobblestones in the courtyard, wooden shutters hung broken from their hinges, and grapevines had grown wild, creating an almost jungle-like tangle around the main buildings. A rusted sign by the entrance read Bodega de los Secretos, Fundada 1489, confirming that he had found the right location. But there was no indication of when or why the vineyard had been abandoned, or whether it was still owned by descendants of the families who had established it. Peter found an unlocked door that led into what had once been the winery's main production area. Rows of massive wooden barrels lined the walls, covered in dust and cobwebs but still structurally sound. The air smelled of old wine and damp stone, creating an atmosphere that was both melancholy and mysterious. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through broken shutters, Peter began to notice details that suggested the vineyard hadn't been abandoned as long ago as its condition suggested. Some of the barrels showed signs of recent maintenance, and there were electric lights that appeared to have been installed within the last few decades. More significantly, many of the barrels were marked with symbols that matched those he had seen throughout his Spanish journey. The same Portuguese maritime symbols that had appeared in Toledo, Granada, Barcelona, and Zaragoza. Peter examined the barrels more carefully, looking for any that might contain something other than wine. Most were clearly empty and had been for years, but several in the back row seemed to have been sealed more recently and showed no signs of the wine stains that marked the others. Using a crowbar he found among the abandoned winery equipment, Peter carefully opened one of the sealed barrels. Inside, protected by oiled cloth and waterproof containers, were documents that made him realize the Bodega de los Secretos had been actively used by his family's network much more recently than the 15th century. The first package he examined contained correspondence dated from the 1930s and 1940s, written in Spanish and Portuguese. The letters appeared to be personal rather than business communications, filled with expressions of love and concern, but also with references to dangerous times and the need for temporary separation for safety. One letter, dated March 1937, was particularly revealing. "My dearest Carmen, the arrangements have been made through our Portuguese friends. You and the children will be safe at the vineyard until the troubles pass. The network your grandfather helped establish has promised to protect families like ours, regardless of which side they supported before the conflict began." As Peter continued examining the contents of the sealed barrels, he discovered what appeared to be a complete archive of correspondence from Spanish families who had been helped by the network during the turbulent middle decades of the 20th century. The letters painted a picture of an organization that had evolved from its medieval origins into something like an underground railroad for protecting civilians during periods of political upheaval. The most extensive collection belonged to a couple named Eduardo and Carmen Vasquez. Their correspondence, spanning from 1936 to 1945, told the story of a family separated by circumstances beyond their control, reunited through the help of the Portuguese network, and ultimately settled safely in South America with new identities and financial security. The Portuguese gentleman explains that his family has been helping people like us for over 400 years. Eduardo had written to his wife in 1938. They ask for nothing except that we remember their kindness and help others when we are able. It is hard to believe such generosity exists in these dark times. Carmen's replies, preserved in remarkable condition, revealed the human cost of the historical events that Peter had only read about in textbooks. "The children ask when you will come home," she wrote. "I tell them that good people are helping us stay safe, and that someday we will all be together again in a place where no one will try to hurt us because of what we believe." But it was a letter dated December 1943 that made Peter understand the true scope of his family's activities during this period. Eduardo wrote, "I have learned more about our benefactors from Don Mateus. The network is not just Portuguese. It includes families from Germany, Italy, Catalonia, and even some from England. They have been moving people and protecting assets for centuries, using wine shipments, art collections, and manuscript preservation as cover for their activities." Peter realized that his family hadn't just been preserving documents and artifacts. They had been running a sophisticated international humanitarian operation, using the cover of cultural preservation to protect people whose lives were in danger from political upheaval. The final letter in Eduardo and Carmen's collection was postmarked from Buenos Aires in 1946. "We are safe, we are together, and we will never forget the kindness that saved our family. The vineyard in La Rioja will always be sacred to us, and someday, when it is safe, we will return to thank the Portuguese family that gave us back our lives." What do you think about this humanitarian side of Peter's family legacy? It seems his ancestors weren't just treasure hunters. They were saving lives. But what price comes with inheriting such a powerful network? Share your thoughts in the comments. Peter spent several hours reading through the letters, gradually understanding that the Bodega de los Secretos had served as much more than a storage facility. It had been a safe house, a communication center, and a distribution point for resources that helped displaced families start new lives in safer locations. The documents revealed a network that had operated across multiple countries and decades, coordinating with sympathetic officials, religious organizations, and merchant families to move people and assets out of dangerous situations. The wine barrels hadn't just hidden documents. They had concealed gold, jewelry, artwork, and other portable wealth that could be converted to cash for refugee families. But Peter also found evidence that the network's activities hadn't ended in the 1940s. More recent documents, dating from the 1980s and 1990s, showed that the organization had continued helping people displaced by various conflicts throughout the late 20th century. The tradition continues. Read a note dated 1987, written in English. New generations of the founding families maintain the commitment to protection and preservation. The vineyard stands ready to serve those in need, as it has for 5 centuries. Peter began to understand that his inheritance wasn't just financial, it was moral. He wasn't being asked to simply claim money and assets accumulated by his ancestors. He was being offered leadership of an organization that had saved hundreds, perhaps thousands, of lives over the course of its existence. The realization was both inspiring and terrifying. Could he live up to the humanitarian legacy his family had created? And more importantly, was he prepared to accept the risks and responsibilities that came with operating outside normal legal and governmental channels? The weight of legacy. As Peter continued exploring the vineyard, he found evidence that the facility had been designed with security and concealment as primary concerns. The wine cellars connected to a network of underground passages that led to multiple exits, some of them several hundred meters from the main buildings. Storage chambers hidden beneath false floors contained documents, artwork, and other valuables that represented centuries of careful preservation. But the most significant discovery was a modern office hidden behind a false wall in what had appeared to be an abandoned storage room. The office contained computers, filing cabinets, and communication equipment that looked like it had been used within the last few years. The computer files, protected by passwords that took Peter several attempts to crack using significant dates from his family history, revealed the current scope of the network's operations. Bank accounts in multiple countries held assets worth hundreds of millions of euros. Real estate holdings included properties in Spain, Portugal, France, Germany, and several South American countries. Investment portfolios included shares in major corporations, government bonds, and commodity holdings that had been accumulating returns for decades. But more troubling were files that showed the network's continued involvement in moving people and assets across international borders. While the language was careful and often coded, it was clear that the organization was still actively helping individuals and families who needed to relocate quickly and quietly, often without the knowledge or approval of government authorities. Peter found himself facing an ethical dilemma he hadn't anticipated. His family's network had undoubtedly saved lives and preserved cultural treasures, but it had also operated outside legal frameworks for centuries. The humanitarian goals were admirable, but the methods involved document forgery, tax avoidance, and activities that most governments would consider illegal. As he studied the financial records, Peter's phone buzzed with a text message that made his blood run cold. "We know you're at the Vineyard, Peter. It's time for a conversation about your future. We're 5 minutes away." Peter quickly gathered the most important documents he had found, stuffed them into his backpack, and looked for an escape route. The underground passages he had discovered earlier might provide a way to avoid whoever was approaching, but he realized that his time for independent exploration had run out. Klaus and his associates had found him, and the choice he had been avoiding since Barcelona was about to be forced upon him. Confrontation underground. Peter made his way to the wine cellars and located the entrance to the underground passage system he had discovered earlier. The passages were narrow and poorly lit, but they offered his best chance of avoiding the confrontation he wasn't ready for. As he moved through the tunnels, Peter could hear voices and footsteps above him in the main winery buildings. Klaus's German accent was unmistakable, but there were at least 2 other people with him, and their conversation suggested they knew the vineyard's layout well. "He'll have found the office by now," Klaus was saying. "The question is whether he's ready to accept the responsibilities that come with the inheritance." "And if he's not?" asked a woman's voice with a British accent. "Then we proceed with containment protocols," Klaus replied coldly. "The network is too important to be compromised by personal sentimentality." Peter found a chamber in the underground system that appeared to have been designed as a secure meeting room. Stone benches lined the walls, and there was evidence of electric lighting and ventilation systems. But more importantly, there were multiple exits that led to different parts of the vineyard property. In this chamber, Peter found the archive he had been seeking since Toledo, the complete records of the network's operations from its founding in the late 15th century to the present day. Leather-bound ledgers contained detailed accounts of assets moved, people protected, and operations conducted across Europe and beyond. The most recent ledger was particularly revealing. It showed that the network currently maintained active operations in 12 countries, with an annual budget of over 50 million euros derived from investment returns on assets accumulated over 5 centuries. The organization helped an average of 200 people per year relocate to safer situations, often providing new identities, financial support, and long-term protection. But Peter also found records of activities that made him uncomfortable. The network had occasionally worked with governments and organizations whose human rights records were questionable, justifying these relationships as necessary for protecting their humanitarian operations. Some of the people they had helped relocate had been fleeing not persecution, but legal consequences for their own actions. The sound of footsteps in the underground passages interrupted Peter's reading. Klaus and his associates had found the entrance to the tunnel system and were systematically searching for him. "Thank you for staying with us through these incredible discoveries." Peter has learned that his inheritance comes with both humanitarian glory and moral complexity. But now he's trapped underground with Klaus closing in. What choice will he make? Peter gathered the most critical documents from the archive and prepared to move deeper into the passage system. But as he reached one of the exits, he found Klaus waiting for him, flanked by the British woman he had heard earlier and a third person he didn't recognize. "Hello, Peter," Klaus said calmly. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your family's legacy and your role in continuing it." Peter clutched his backpack containing the documents he had gathered, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "I think I've learned enough about my family's legacy, Klaus, including the fact that you've been lying to me since Toledo." Klaus nodded acknowledgement. "I've been managing your introduction to the network, yes, but not lying about its importance or your role in its future. Peter, what you've discovered today represents one of the most significant humanitarian organizations in European history. Your ancestors didn't just preserve documents and accumulate wealth, they saved lives." The British woman stepped forward. "Mr. Matthews, I'm Sarah Chun, representing the Administrative Council of the Preservation Network. We've been monitoring your progress through Spain with great interest." "Monitoring?" Peter challenged. "You mean manipulating? Every city I've visited, every document I've found, every person I've met. It's all been orchestrated to bring me to this moment." "To bring you to understanding," Sarah corrected. "Peter, your family has been the coordinating authority for this network for over 500 years. Your grandfather maintained that authority until his death, at which point operational control passed to a council of allied families. But the network needs a Matthias descendant to function at full capacity." Klaus opened a briefcase and withdrew several documents. "These are the current operational reports, Peter. In the last year alone, we've helped relocate 247 people from dangerous situations. We've preserved artwork and manuscripts worth millions of euros that would otherwise have been destroyed. We've maintained financial networks that allow resources to flow to people and organizations that can't access traditional banking systems." Peter studied the documents Klaus offered, recognizing the scope and sophistication of the operations they described. "And if I refuse to take over this network?" Sarah and Klaus exchanged glances. "Then the network continues under council authority," Sarah replied. "But certain assets and capabilities that are tied specifically to your family's authority would become inactive." "You mean you'd lose access to accounts and resources that belong to my family? Resources that have been used for humanitarian purposes for centuries," Klaus emphasized. "Peter, this isn't about personal wealth or power. It's about continuing a tradition of protecting people who have nowhere else to turn." Peter found himself genuinely torn. The evidence he had seen throughout the day proved that his family's network had indeed saved lives and preserved cultural treasures. But he had also seen evidence of activities that operated in legal and moral gray areas. The confrontation in the underground chamber stretched for nearly an hour, with Klaus and Sarah presenting detailed arguments about Peter's moral obligation to continue his family's humanitarian work. They showed him photographs of families who had been helped by the network, testimonials from people whose lives had been saved, and documentation of cultural artifacts that had been preserved for future generations. But they also made it clear that refusing to cooperate wasn't really an option. The network had invested too much in bringing Peter to this point, and they had accumulated too much knowledge about his activities in Chicago and Spain to simply let him walk away. "You understand information networks, Peter," Sarah pointed out. "You know how valuable certain kinds of knowledge can be, and how dangerous it can be for people who possess it without the proper protection." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. If Peter refused to join the network, he would be considered a security risk that needed to be managed. "I need time to think about this," Peter said finally. "What you're asking me to accept is a lifetime commitment to activities that most governments would consider illegal." "Most governments," Klaus replied, "don't understand the difference between criminal activity and humanitarian necessity. Peter, we're offering you the chance to continue a tradition that your family started 5 centuries ago, protecting people and preserving knowledge when official institutions fail to do so." As they argued, Peter noticed that Sarah had positioned herself between him and the exit he had planned to use. But there was another passage, one that he had explored earlier, that led to an emergency exit near the Vineyards' northern boundary. "I'll give you my answer tomorrow," Peter said, slowly moving toward his alternative exit. "But I need to see more documentation about current operations before I can make such a significant decision." Klaus nodded. That's reasonable. But Peter, understand that we can't allow you to continue traveling around Spain unsupervised. There are other parties interested in what you've been discovering, and not all of them share our humanitarian goals. Peter reached the entrance to his escape passage. Then I guess you'll have to trust that I understand the importance of what you've shown me. Before Klaus and Sarah could react, Peter ducked into the narrow tunnel and began moving quickly toward the northern exit. Behind him, he could hear Klaus calling out, but the passage was too narrow for quick pursuit. Peter emerged from the underground system about 200 meters from where he had parked his rental car. As he made his way through the abandoned vineyard, he could see flashlights moving through the main buildings as Klaus and his associates searched for him. But Peter had accomplished what he had come to La Rioja to do. He now understood the full scope of his family's legacy, both its humanitarian achievements and its moral complexities. More importantly, he had documented evidence of the network's current operations and financial holdings. As he drove away from the Bodega de los Secretos, Peter's phone buzzed with a text message. Running won't solve this, Peter. The choice you're avoiding will find you wherever you go. But perhaps it's time you understood that there are other parties interested in your inheritance, parties that don't share our commitment to humanitarian goals. Peter realized that his Spanish adventure was entering a new phase. He was no longer just discovering his family's history. He was being hunted by multiple parties who wanted to control what he had learned. The documents in his backpack represented centuries of accumulated wealth and power, but they also represented danger for anyone who possessed them without the protection of the network that had created them. As he drove through the dark La Rioja countryside, Peter knew that he needed to make a decision soon. He could accept his role as the inheritor of a humanitarian network that operated outside legal boundaries, or he could try to find a way to escape from a legacy that was becoming increasingly difficult to abandon. But first, he needed to get far enough ahead of Klaus and his associates to have time to think clearly about what he had learned and what choices remained available to him. Thank you for staying with us through this incredible revelation in La Rioja. The abandoned vineyard revealed that Peter's family legacy includes centuries of humanitarian work, saving lives and protecting families during history's darkest moments. But the choice facing Peter has become even more complex. Klaus and his network want him to lead a billion-euro humanitarian organization, but they've also made it clear that refusing isn't really an option. And now there are hints of other parties with less noble intentions who are also interested in Peter's inheritance. The love letters hidden in wine barrels showed the beautiful side of Peter's family legacy, generations of people whose lives were saved by the network his ancestors created. But the modern documents revealed that this humanitarian work comes with moral gray areas and legal risks that could define the rest of Peter's life. What do you think Peter should do? Accept leadership of a network that saves lives but operates outside the law? Or continue trying to escape from a legacy that seems determined to claim him? And who are these other parties that Klaus mentioned? What do they want with Peter's inheritance, and how dangerous might they be? Don't miss the next episode where Peter's journey continues and the stakes get even higher. The choices he makes next could determine not just his own future, but the fate of a humanitarian network that has been operating for over 5 centuries. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment of this incredible saga. The most crucial decisions are still ahead.